Hey, it's Matthew Todd and welcome to the last lesson in Module 4. In this module, we've talked about some of the reasons that TDD can be initially hard or intimidating, that combination of development practices that TDD forces us to address all at once. We've also talked about different levels of tests that we might have, as well as some things to think about when deciding what tests we might need to create at each different level. Note that for all of these types of tests, we can choose whether to write the test after the fact, or following a test-first approach. It's easier to take a test-first approach at the unit test level, but it's not impossible to do this at other test levels as well. In this lesson, I want to take all of the material we've covered in this module and present a way of managing all of this and making the decision-making process easier for ourselves when we write these tests, when deciding how we ensure that the code we write is good quality and will remain maintainable over time. So, we've talked about levels of testing, which is what we're testing. Testing for purpose is a strategy for making the creation of these tests easier, more consistent, and doing so in a way which will maximise the value that we get out of these tests, for example when refactoring, as we've seen before. And we've talked about TDD, taking a test-driven approach, which is about when we're writing the tests, choosing to create test code before application code, and having that very rapid feedback cycle of test implementation, test implementation. So now, putting it all together, I want to introduce test statements. These are statements you can put together that are specific to the codebase that you're working on. They describe the approaches that you want to take with testing. So they describe exactly what you want to test, when you want to test it, and what those tests should look like. So looking at some example statements you could come up with. The first test statement you have could be something like unit tests will be created for all classes containing business logic, where we use Mocha as the unit testing framework, sign-in for mocking, and chai expect style of assertions. We will use a test-driven approach for writing code that can be tested in this way. We will use the strategy of testing for purpose to ensure we focus each test on verifying a single piece of behaviour. A second statement, building on this, might be integration tests will be created to ensure the configuration and behaviour of our API server is correct. These tests will be written using Mocha, supertest, with chai expect style of assertions. These tests will have far less use of sign-in, only using to fake system time, and will interact with the real database. These tests will not test business logic. We will use a test-driven approach for writing code that can be tested in this way. We will use the strategy of testing for purpose to ensure we focus each test on verifying a single piece of behaviour. A third statement could be Selenium tests will be created to ensure the web application behaves as expected. These tests will use a stub implementation of the API rather than a real running API. These tests will not test business logic that's within the API, only presentation logic, logic specific to the web application. Some tests will be written before the application code, some tests will be written after the application code, but always committed alongside the application code. We will use the strategy of testing for purpose to ensure that the focus on each test is verifying a single piece of behaviour. And finally, statement 4. End-to-end tests will be created to ensure the web application is able to operate with all other parts of the system. There should be a very small number of tests, purely to verify system correctness rather than any business logic. These tests will be written using Mocha with chai expect style of assertions. These tests will be written after there's enough of a system running that could enable this level of testing. We will use the strategy of testing for purpose to ensure we focus each test on verifying a single piece of behaviour. Now the test statements you choose will depend on your problem domain, solution domain, as well as your development approach. These are specific and unique to your team, codebase and situation. Also, they may change over time. So don't be afraid to update these regularly as you find out what works, what doesn't, as your architecture evolves over time. Also, the example statements are purely focused on functional testing, but you should also do the same when it comes to the non-functional side of testing as well. So having these test statements I find makes it very easy for new and existing developers alike to work on the codebase, knowing exactly what's expected from a test and quality viewpoint. It's going to reduce the likelihood of seeing differences in test approach from one developer to the next. And it's also going to reduce the likelihood of duplicating tests, as we talked about in the last lesson. It's going to give you that consistency, which will make development quicker and easier to maintain over time. Okay, so with the idea of test statements, everything we've covered to date, and those example test statements in mind, I now want to set you an exercise. So I want you to think about the project or projects you're working on right now, pick one of them, and go through the exercise of creating test statements. Now these can be idealized statements, so statements of how you think your system should be tested, irrespective of how it currently is being tested. Remember to think about that test pyramid and avoiding duplication as you move up that pyramid. And when coming up with test statements, you may find that they're quite far removed from how you're currently testing, but that's perfectly okay. If you do find yourself in that situation, then these test statements can serve as a guiding light for how you want to be working. So they're giving you something to aim for, so that when you do work on that codebase, you can work on heading in that direction. So you can start creating new tests how you want them to be, and hopefully demonstrate productivity improvements, quality improvements, and chip away at the existing system over time as you work on it, with full knowledge and focus of where you're heading. So as an example, I've seen many organisations choose to drop one test framework for another, maybe dropping one test system for Cucumber BDD style tests, because they found their existing tests quite slow and cumbersome. And it felt good to start with, working on something new, but because they didn't have a clear test strategy in mind, they didn't know where they wanted to end up. They didn't have a shared view of the different test levels, their test strategies as a whole, their new tests. So using the new framework quickly became a mirror of the old tests. It suffered from exactly the same problems that the previous one did. Unfortunately, they still had trouble seeing that, and were looking at dropping the new test framework for another new one instead. And this is the kind of mistake I want to stop you from making, and I found that test statements like the example ones can really help with this. So, I'll wrap up now, leave it for this lesson. I'll leave you to download the worksheet and complete your own test statements, and look forward to seeing you in the next module.